Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and a whole new tech tree of Chinese heavy tanks just arrived on the 1.19.1 test server, and so today I'm going to be letting you know my initial opinions on all four of the new vehicles. So firstly, if I haven't said enough times, it's time for you to uncheck accelerated crew training in your Type 58, because the Tier 7 BZ58 is going to lead on from it. And you are going to need both of the engines unlocked and 56,000 experience as it stands to be able to get the BZ58 on release day. So, the BZ58, what is this tank and what is it all about? Well, this Tier 7 Heavy is about as well-rounded as it gets in World of Tanks. It's got decent damage per minute with its 100mm main armament, standard amounts of penetration, definitely not the best gun handling, 10 degrees of gun depression, which will make it very flexible, and it's roughly about as fast as a T29, with the same amount of hit points as a T29, and it's also got a rather decent turret, as long as your opponents only have about 195mm of pen, and as soon as they've got more than that, then the whole of the front of the turret, you only need 220mm to be able to get through it half of the time. Accordingly, that means that the Tier 7 is going to be pretty good inside a nice matchup when exposing its turret, but when you're playing against Tier 8 and Tier 9 tanks, this turret is definitely not going to hold up very well. Another thing to mention about this tank's armor model is that it has these big flaps that extend over the side of the hull, and so if it is using its 10 degrees of gun depression, if you've got a 91mm caliber gun, you will be able to overmatch this part of the tank. And this lower plate, yeah, that thing is absolutely horrendous. Good luck hiding that. Imagine coming around the corner, even angled like this, and you're still going to have a vulnerable lower plate. The vehicle is also incredibly long and has a horrible turret silhouette that kind of reminds me of a French heavy tank, the AMX M445, and that's not a good thing. It's going to be hard to hide this turret. And awkwardly as well, even against opponents that only have 195mm of pen, even if you turn the turret slightly towards the left of the right, the whole of your side turret is going to be a weak point for your opponents. Add to this 350 meters view range, and this one could end up being quite an awkward Tier 7 to play outside of a good matchup. The saving grace of this tank is a really nicely angled upper hull, probably because the lower plate is just so huge. And so if you are able to hide that lower plate, then the whole of the upper hull is an auto ricochet, even if you're not using any of your gun depression. Interestingly enough, because of the way that the turret is shaped, whether you're not using your gun depression at all, you need 220mm to get through it, and if you're using the most amount of gun depression you can get, you still only need 222mm to get through the turret front. And that's because it's very thick for a Tier 7 tank, but incredibly flat. And so accordingly, you actually don't really want to be using all of your gun depression, bizarrely enough, in this tank, because the upper hull is a ricochet anyway. So your priority should be able to just hide your lower plate and then just hope that your opponents don't have the penetration to be able to go through your turret. The main feature of the BZ58 is going to be the rocket boost functionality, and this will take up a rather average speed heavy tank and pump it up to 52.5 kilometers an hour. The engine power will also nearly triple to 1,750, and you are going to have nearly 34 power to weight ratio without a turbo of being able to plow forwards. This rocket boost duration will last for 10 seconds, and the Tier 7 vehicle has 3 charges, so you better use them at important moments of the battle. And 3 charges, you really feel like you're going to be limited only using 2 to get into position, and then probably have 1 for a reserve for an emergency. All in all on this tank, I'm probably going to end up using vents, a gun rammer, and then possibly a turbo on this vehicle, or an accuracy device to try and improve that tank's horrible accuracy. But be warned, until you have all of the field mods to be able to improve the awful view range that this vehicle has, you aren't going to be seeing anyone at any kind of distance unless you've got a really good crew and a premium consumable. With regards to an upgrade path on this tank, I thoroughly recommend that you consider getting the turret first, because without that top turret, you've only got 190mm of frontal turret armor, and you even have a weak point on top of the tank. So try and do everything you can to be able to get that turret quickly. Luckily, the vehicle's turret only weighs 500 kilograms, and the vehicle's got about 1.4 tons spare, so you should easily be able to mount the turret without having to go for the tracks. Then, I'll personally go for the gun on this vehicle to be able to gain that extra alpha damage and that extra penetration. But be warned that this puts the vehicle without the tracks right on the cusp of being able to actually fit everything on. And we're talking about by 20 kilograms here. So hopefully you can get one of your crew members to stop having so many snacks. And this is with using a vent, the accuracy device, and a turbo. So keep in mind that you will not actually be able to put a gun rammer instead of the accuracy device on this vehicle, as it will literally weigh too much. And having a second thought about this, I'd actually recommend a starting build of possibly a vent, a gun rammer, and coated optics to get things started off with. And that's because the stock gun is pretty accurate to begin with anyway, and it's not until you get to the upgraded gun that you're even going to consider improving the accuracy. Then from here, I'd probably end up getting the tracks, which will then allow me to switch out the coated optics, probably for a turbo to get a little bit of the extra speed, which scales very nicely with the boost on this tank. And then you can start to work your way towards the engines and towards its bigger brother, the BZ-166. So the BZ-166, first impressions with the stock turret and the hull. Wow, that's a really weird hull design with this kind of step pattern on the hull there as it's going down. I wonder if Wargaming have actually modeled that in the armor model. Well, we can find out whether Wargaming has modeled that in the armor model right here. And they actually have. Look at that. Really bizarre. That means that there's going to be some parts of the vehicle that are going to be impossible to pen pretty much even from an angle like this, and some parts that will be easy. Wow, talk about RNG. All in all, it kind of has a British hull design, at least in my opinion. It kind of looks a bit chieftain-esque, doesn't it? But all of that doesn't mean anything if the statistics aren't good. So let's take a look to see what the BZ-166 is special for. Well, its DPM is okay, alpha damage 420, accuracy's poor, gun handling's okay, gun depression is still a lovely 10 degrees, the vehicle speed is pretty good, vehicle's view range is horrendous, had to check to make sure I'm still not looking at the tier 7, no I'm not, and it's got a good old slab of hit points. When it comes down to the armor of the vehicle, ooh, yeah, this one's thick. Sure, if you can avoid getting hit in the lower plate, this is some very good turret armor. It does have a bit of a weak point, but if you're using your 10 degrees of gun depression, that's going to be an even harder target to be able to hit. And wow, the Chinese tanks really just do have thick turret armor, which means that even if somebody has 270 millimeters of gold pen, they aren't going to be able to get through it at all. It does have a couple of weak points here to the left and the right of the turret when it's using too much of its gun depression, but apart from that, this thing looks like a very solid heavy tank. It's just a shame that the gun is just so positively lackluster and average. But I think this thing is going to do pretty well as a tier 8 tank, even against tier 9 and tier 10 opponents. Rocket boost wise, the charges have gone up to 4, and when you use those rocket boosts, yeah, it's the same speed as the tier 7 identically. Upgrade path wise, it's very nice that this vehicle comes with the only gun, and it's stock. This is a very okay gun to have on a tier 8 tank. It's not incredible, but it's definitely not awful, and to have that stock will save you some free experience. Luckily, this vehicle has 2.5 tons to be able to play around with, and considering that the turret is actually lighter than the stock turret, that's the first thing that I would recommend to go for, and you're easily going to be able to fit that on. However, until you get the upgraded engine on this vehicle, oh my lord, 550 horsepower is not really going to get you very far. And this might be one of the biggest engine upgrades I've ever seen in World of Tanks history. Going from 550 to 770, it's going to be a night and day difference between those two engines. Ironically, however, you actually have more chance to be set on fire with the top engine. So I'm of a split opinion now whether I would recommend going for the turret or going for the engine first, especially considering that the turret actually looks like it's pretty good. It's definitely not as thick against high penetration rounds towards the side and towards the top of the tank, but it actually doesn't have a weak point at all. And so that stock turret might actually be arguably just as good, if not even better, than the upgraded turret because of that lack of weakness. And so accordingly, I'd actually recommend that you consider going for the engine first on this vehicle, because otherwise you're just going to be so slow. So I guess the next question is, should you even get the upgraded turret at all? Well, yeah, I think good luck trying to play with only 50 meters view range. Sorry, 330 instead of 350 meters view range. And the stock turret means that you'll have to sacrifice 50 hit points, 0.2 seconds aim time, and also a little bit of rate of fire. So I definitely would recommend getting that upgraded turret, but I'd go for the engine first, then the turret, Then I'll get the tracks. Will I bother with the radio? Luckily, the radio is from all of the other Chinese tanks already in the game, so make sure you've unlocked that if you want to have this radio from the get-go. And then it'll be time to progress towards the BZ-68. So all in all, the tier 8, it definitely looks like a solid heavy tank. I'm personally, once again, probably going to be ending up using vents with a gun rammer and probably a turbo on this vehicle, otherwise it's just going to end up being too slow. But once again, I do worry about that poor view range. I worry about the weak point on top, and also with the horrible base accuracy of this vehicle of 0.42, managing to actually hit anything at decent distances. Alright, so now let's take a look at the BZ-68. This is the tier 9 Chinese heavy tank. And let's have first impressions. Wow, what a weird looking vehicle. Traditional hull shape now, very well angled. Wonder how thick the lower plate is going to be. Very weird side armor. I can immediately see that there could be a big weak point along there. And that stock turret kind of reminds me of the Italian tier 9 Progetto 66. What a freaky tank. So firstly, let's see how good this stock turret is. Well, if you've got 248mm of pen, you're not really going to be dealing with it very reliably, although it does have a weak point on top. But if you're using the tank's 8 degrees of gun depression, it's hard to be able to hit. However, I do expect if people are loading gold against you, then your whole turret front just becomes absolutely awful. So yeah, that stock turret isn't good so far. However, the upgraded turret is much thicker, and now, even with 315mm of heat pen, they're only going to be going through you about a quarter of the time. So these Chinese tanks, they're thick, and I believe if you're using your gun depression, that turret armor actually becomes to be a ricochet for everything apart from about 370mm of pen. Wow, this thing's armor looks formidable, actually. Good angling on the upper hull. Yeah, that part of the side does become a weak point when you're going to try to side scrape, which is going to be awkward. Horrible lower plate, and an opportunity for all 76mm caliber guns to overmatch up through the tracks. But interestingly, this part of the hull, this flap here, it doesn't actually extend all the way along the tank, which means that if you're shooting up into your opponents, you're really going to have to fire towards the front of the track and not the rear of the track if you also want to overmatch. Alright, let's take a look at this thing statistically in other areas. So it comes with 130mm with 530 alpha damage. 2120 DPM is pretty good. Bad accuracy, okay gun handling. Same speed as the previous vehicle with a reasonable power to weight ratio. 8 degrees of gun depression is 2 degrees less than the previous tank. However, it does have 30 meters more view range, and it's got a good old slab of hit points. Yeah, I don't really see the evolution in these tanks. They kind of just feel as if they're just a little bit better each time with regards to the armor, and everything else remains the same. But it's got 5 rocket boots instead of 4 from the previous vehicle, so that's great. Alright, what would be my recommended upgrade path for this vehicle? Well, the first thing I always like to do is check how much spare capacity it has. This one has nearly 3.3 tons, or over 3.3 tons, and so I doubt that the turret is going to be that much heavier. It's actually 2 tons heavier, but that should still be okay. So I would recommend to get the turret on this tank first, and the turret will prevent you from being absolutely butchered by premium rounds. Next, I'd recommend going for the engine, and then you've still got space to be able to fit everything on before you then eventually go for the tracks. And it's interesting because these engines, with regards to the rocket capacities on the Chinese heavy tanks, they scale up with the boost as well. And so the stock engine is 1,500 horsepower. The rocket engine, fully upgraded, is 1,925. So it is worth investing in the engines of these vehicles. And that's probably why Wargaming has made it so you have to unlock the engine to be able to advance up the tech tree. Another nice thing about this vehicle is that the gun is actually stock, like its predecessor, so you're not really going to have to waste too much there. I think that will end up making these Chinese heavy tanks pretty darn good to play for free-to-play players, because you've got a decent gun, a very good gun, right from the get-go on a tank, and any vehicle that's like that is a good opportunity. So all in all, for the BZ-68, what do I think about it? It's going to be just a generic tier 9 heavy. It's probably going to use some of its 5 boosts. So it's going to be able to boost for 50 seconds during a battle. That's pretty crazy to just get into a position and be able to dominate a ridgeline. I don't like the fact that the vehicle's got 8 degrees of gun depression instead of 10. It's the first Chinese heavy tank as well of this new BZ branch that doesn't have 10 degrees that I've seen so far. But all in all, I think it'll be a decent enough vehicle. And interestingly enough as well, if you get the final field mod of this vehicle, that will increase its top speed limit by 4 kilometers an hour. And remember, that will also scale with the rocket boost of the tank. So with the 4 kilometers extra from the power supply rewiring, and if you take a mobility slot and you put your turbo in there, that now means the new base top speed limit of this tank is 44 kilometers an hour. And that also means that the new top speed limit of the tank will be 66 kilometers an hour, with a power to weight ratio when you're using those rocket boosters of 35 tons, or horsepower to ton, I should say. That will make this one of the fastest heavy tanks in the game, at least when it's boosting. And considering that the vehicle does weigh 60 tons, yeah, get yourself controlled impact on your driver, and you will be definitely taking it towards your opponents. Alrighty then, so ladies and gents, boys and girls, let's work towards the tier 10 tank. The tier 10 tank now, the BZ-75, and let's also talk about it. So, in the 1960s, amid tensions relating with the USSR, China came up with the concept for creating frontier covering forces. The main firepower of this formation was to be units with frontier covering tanks in service. One of the projects for such vehicles was the BZ-75, developed in 1975 using the experience gained developing the WZ-111 heavy tank. During working on the turret, engineers incorporated the design features of the WZ-1224 project. No BZ-75 prototypes were manufactured. Also, no mention about rockets. Were the Chinese actually planning on putting rockets on vehicles? Possibly. So, what is the BZ-75 and what is it good for? Well, firstly, let's talk about it visually. Yeah, that clearly does look like a WZ-111 hull. That could be a good thing, but also might not be a good thing. And the turret looks like an absolute freak. It's got 3 weak points in theory on it, but this kind of very well angled and I expect exceptionally thick hull or turret armor will be formidable to be able to try and get through. So here you go. This is what it looks like versus 258 millimeters of pen. Yeah, good luck getting through 400 millimeters of turret armor. Only a Jagdpanzer E100 is going to do that about 2/3 of the time. Even against 319 millimeters of heat pen, it's only got a slight weak point to the left and to the right of the gun. And until the tank turns the turret like this, you still need about 300 millimeters to be able to get through that turret. However, those weak points on top are really obvious. Wow, they're so flat actually. Look at them. That's awful. You only need 223 to be able to get through the one in the middle, and you need 170 to get through the one on the left and the right. What about if you're using your gun depression? Okay, 240 to get through the middle, 180 to be able to get through the weak points on the left and the right. Okay, Wargaming, hats off to you for actually putting weak points on heavy tanks. It's just a shame that all of the other vehicles in the game don't have weak points. Also, I'm noticing that this vehicle has 45 millimeters of flap armor, which means that you're going to need a 150 millimeter caliber gun to be able to overmatch that. So that will make this thing very good at kind of on a ridge line using its 8 degrees of gun depression. It'd be very hard to be able to deal with this vehicle like that. However, this thing has a horrible lower plate with only 200 millimeters of effective hull armor, and even if you're angled like this, it's still pretty easy to be able to go through. The upper hull is nice, but it's only 300, so heat rounds are still going to be able to go through this quite easily when it's over-angling. And also one thing that I just noticed that I already hate about this vehicle is it does have a little bar on the back that's going to be flat and easily shootable from the front, even with AP, and you only need 150 millimeters to be able to get through that. All right, so armor is hit and miss, really. Let's take a look at it statistically. So nearly 2,300 DPM. That's actually really nice. That puts it just below the 60 TP, which I guess when I think about it, isn't actually very nice. It's probably got one of the lower ends of the damage per minute in the game, along with the VK7201K and the E100. Now, remember that those tanks all have very high alpha damage guns, and the BZ-175 has a 152mm caliber gun with 650 alpha damage. So that's the same as the alpha damage on the 705A. I'm seeing a lot of things that I don't like, actually. Accuracy poor, gun handling okay, definitely not bad, but not something to celebrate either. One thing that is nice is this vehicle has a good shell velocity on its standard round, and it's got heat rounds with 319mm of pen, which is ever so a little bit higher than the heat rounds on the Object 705A, for example. Top speed of this vehicle is 35. Reverse speed is 15, which is nice. It has 6 rocket boost charges, 8 degrees of gun depression, and whoa, a big old slab of hit points, 2,500, which actually puts this tank right up there as the joint 5th most healthy heavy tank in the game. So that's actually really cool, because a vehicle like the 705A, for example, is another super heavy tank with 2,450. But when you think about vehicles like the AMX M454 with their 2,200, this has definitely got a cut above what we would consider to be some of the other hard-hitting tanks. Sure, it's not quite as healthy as the 60 TP or the E100 or hitting as hard as those vehicles, but that's a decent old slab of hit points. 390 meters view range, it's not great, but it's nothing to worry about considering that you can take a field mod that improves the view range by 3%, which means that nobody's ever going to have coated optics on this tank if you've got a good crew. Interestingly enough, Wargaming are giving this tank assault field mods, whereas the tier 7, the tier 8, and the tier 9 all got breakthrough field mods. That's very interesting. And I'm not sure if it's a bug, but what that means is that you're only going to be able to get 2 kilometers an hour faster forwards compared to the tier 9, which could get 4. So the tier 9 will actually end up being quicker than this vehicle. However, it does mean that the final field mod that you get on this vehicle will allow you to improve the internal module durability and the repair speed of this vehicle at the expense of a bit of turret traverse, speed, and dispersion. And that is something I am definitely willing to take, considering how often Chinese tanks take module damage. And the BZ-75 is looking like another hold-down monster heavy tank, albeit with weak points on top, and enough things to actually dislike about the vehicle that I don't think it's really going to replace something like an AMX M454 in the meta. However, stay tuned to the channel, as tomorrow I'll be releasing a full tank preview of the vehicle with gameplay so that I can give you my full opinion. So all in all, the Chinese new heavy rocket branch, the BZ-58, the BZ-166, the BZ-68, and the BZ-75. What do I think about them? They're alright. It looks like they're just heavy tanks that only get to go quick every once in a while, and they sit there hull down with good turrets and dominate strong positions. However, one thing that really surprises me about this branch is that they've all got less interesting guns than the tier 8 premium that we just saw. I was truly expecting that the tier 10, for example, was going to get a much more interesting gun. It looks a lot like the gun on the Object 705A, for example, incredibly like the gun on the Object 705A. And that's not a good thing. The 705A is probably one of my least favorite tanks in the game, and so unless the BZ-75's got a lot else to work with, it's a little bit of a miss for me with regards to adding variety to World of Tanks. And while the rocket boost functionality is kind of fun, I do feel that Wargaming have missed an opportunity to add some kind of interesting gun mechanic with this vehicle, or these vehicles, considering what kind of a bar they set with the BZ-176. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't want to see another overpowered branch of heavy tanks going into the game, but I was kind of expecting them to be just a little bit different. They're kind of looking a lot like the Polish heavies, for example, that can just sometimes go a little bit quicker. But I think they have enough drawbacks in other areas that these vehicles, they'll be a little bit memey with their rockets. But I think that that's possibly all they're going to become, is kind of a few memey tanks to blow off a bit of steam, if you forgive the pun, with the rockets on these vehicles. But remember, this is all early days for the Chinese heavy tank branch. It's only the first iteration of the test server, and I do expect that we're going to see slight buffs to these vehicles over the test server period. But honestly, what I think Wargaming should do and what they actually do are often two completely different things. Anyway, ladies and gents, boys and girls, that was it for my look at all of the new vehicles of the new Chinese heavy tank branch. If you liked the video and you thought it was useful, especially with regards to upgrade strategies for this vehicle, if you're not going to try and spam free experience, then give the video a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down, and let me know what you think about the new branch in the comments down below. Do you think the vehicles look awesome? Do you think they look whatever? Are you going to bother to grind them? Are you more excited about them now that you've seen them? Are you less excited about them now that you know their statistics? Let me know. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.